I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
On today's episode of The Trade Guys, we have a special guest, Mark Sobel, former Treasury official, and a special topic, defending the dollar and the role of the dollar in international transactions. Thanks again for listening. We hope you enjoy this special Trade Guys. Well, hello, and welcome back to this episode of The Trade Guys. This is Trade Guy Scott. We have a special episode today, time to acknowledge and promote the release of a CSIS video series. The name of the video series is Defending the Dollar. It's intended for a general audience, but it talks about the role of the U.S. dollar in the international economy, why it is the principal international currency in use, and what the threats are to the dollar's status. To cover this topic, we have invited a guest to the program, Mark Sobel, and Mark is a CSIS non-resident expert. We're delighted to have him as the person that, if you imagine a little firebox, red box with glass that says, in case of hard questions about monetary or foreign exchange policy, break glass. And Mark is behind it. So we've broken the glass and asked Mark to come on the program with us. Spent about 4 decades at the Treasury Department, including 15 years as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Monetary and Financial Policy. He spent 4 years as the U.S. representative at the IMF and has had a series of assignments that give him deep expertise on the very subject of money. So, Mark, we welcome you to the program. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. It's a great honor to be on Trade Guys. You guys are regarded as having one of the very best trade podcasts anywhere, and both of you are seen as legendary figures in D.C. on trade policy. So I'm honored as a monetary type to encroach upon your terrain today.
Well, legendary is a word a little bit like veteran. Basically, it means old, but we're still going, and we're happy to have you here. We'll take it.
Fair enough. Well, one of the things that led to this series being produced, the video series about defending the dollar, is that there's a lot of generalized anxiety about the dollar's role and whether it is being supplanted as a means of international exchange. What's going on out there? And while it's true that the U.S. dollar is still the principal and, in fact, dominant currency used to settle international transactions, what's happening at the edges and what are you watching that may or may not be concerning?
Well, thanks for having me. I could carry on for a long time on this. So let me just say, dollar dominance basically means it's the main currency to support the functioning of the international economic and financial system. It finances global trade and capital flows. The U.S., via the dollar, provides investable assets for the world. What's happening with it? The IMF has wonderful data on the dollar's share in central bank reserves. The share fluctuates, but if you look back to the mid-90s and now it's around 60%, it has been edging downward a tad lately. More significant to me is the dollar's role in financing global private financial transactions. The Federal Reserve puts out some wonderful data on that. So most global trade is transacted in dollars, though the euro and RMB can be regionally significant. International bank lending and deposits, dollar share is 60% or more. On bond issuance, it's about 70%. And the BIS surveys on foreign exchange basically show that the overwhelming share of foreign exchange transactions have a dollar leg. I think the question you're asking me is, are there any real challengers to the dollar?
That's a great way to phrase it. Yes.
First of all, I think to get at that question, you have to say, well, why is the dollar dominant? So we have a huge economy, the deepest and most liquid and open capital markets in the world. We've had a relatively decent historical record of macroeconomic management, though frankly, it's far less decent these days. And we've had good rule of law. We've been the world's hegemon, a trusted ally. A strong global network has been built up around the dollar. And investors kind of figure, well, if it ain't broke, why fix it? So are there competitors? So the euro's share of reserves has long hovered around 20%. And it's similar on the private financial stats I discussed. So it's basically a regional currency in many respects. It shares many of the dollar's properties, such as a huge economy, but there aren't really that many euro safe assets, as we say. For example, euro bonds to invest in, as distinct from German government bonds or French government paper.
That's one of the differences between the dollar and the euro, is that we have an integrated monetary and fiscal policy, whereas Europe has an integrated monetary policy, but nation-state fiscal policies.
And so in efforts to build a European capital market or in a fledgling state, most people regard the U.S. economy as more dynamic and innovative than Europe's. Now, one of the interesting things that you see in the reserve data is that global investors have increased holdings of Swiss francs, Canadian and Australian dollars. These are open, liquid capital markets, but they're very small in comparison with us. So the movement to them has been at the margins. So let's get to the elephant in the room. One hears lots about the Chinese currency, the RMB. Well, its share of global reserves is under 3%. Now, China's huge. It's building out an international payments infrastructure free of the dollar. It's cross-border interbank payment system, SIPS. And it's a leader in creating a digital central bank currency. Over a quarter of China's trade is now settled in RMB. But a stronger medium of exchange function isn't going to make the RMB a suitable store of value. The RMB isn't convertible. Capital controls abound. Financial markets have far to go in their evolution. The state's visible hand is increasingly omnipresent and mercurial. The Chinese economy faces huge headwinds now. You can hear about it all the time. Its interactions with Russia will likely give global investors pause. On balance, in my view, the RMB may see its reserve role rise in the coming years, but not appreciably, not by leaps and bounds. Now, sometimes one hears fanciful talk about the IMF special drawing rights, or even nonsensical blather about a BRICS common currency. This is not worth wasting our effort and breath on. I should mention gold. It's clear central bank gold holdings are rising, again, more at the margins. China definitely has been buying gold. India definitely another party always interested in gold. Gold isn't captured in the reserve data I cited earlier. So let me stop there.
That's a great bit of background, Mark. Thank you for that. What I'd like to ask is, you mentioned technology as a factor in at least China's moves in this space. And as we started looking at the history of international currencies, technology was always an important driver. The Dutch guilder became the first international currency because they had the technology to assess purity of coins. They lost out to the British pound, which was the most stable because of technology, in this case, the Industrial Revolution. We're faced with technology again, and wonder if you had some thoughts about digital currencies and the degree to which that creates alternatives to or would someday supplant the dollar.
Well, hearkening back to Bill's statement at the outset, I'm not a spring chicken either. So I'm old and a technological troglodyte, so perhaps I poo-poo the subject because I just don't understand it. So money you can think of as acting as a unit account, a medium of exchange, and a store of value. These are the typical economist functions associated with money. So let's talk about crypto assets for a second, right? And I'm going to distinguish between crypto assets and stablecoins. So take Bitcoin. Watching its swings in value gives one a case of whiplash. So crypto is hardly a store of value. Now, the key stablecoins are pegged to the dollar. So that could be seen as a plus for the dollar's role. But let me turn to what I think you're really asking. So the argument is made if a global payment structure can be wired that bypasses the dollar, that will let countries avoid the clout of U.S. financial sanctions in the midst of U.S. authorities. So much attention focuses on whether the Chinese cross-border interbank payment system, SIPS, as I mentioned earlier, can become a challenger for U.S. global payments infrastructure. A Chinese CBDC, central bank digital currency, could become a vehicle for a global wholesale payments system in this view. Now, this narrative has been heightened by Russia's growing reliance on China. So if you look at SIPS volumes, they're growing quickly but off a low base. They're still minuscule relative to dollar-cleared transactions. Plus, as I mentioned, are you going to store your money in China? There's massive capital outflow from China right now. My troglodyte perspective on this is perhaps payments innovation will lessen the dollar's future systemic role, but it's not anything I spend much time fretting about from an economic standpoint at this time. If I were looking at this question from the standpoint of deploying sanctions, it might raise my eyebrows more.
That's a very important point, Mark, and I'd like to move into sanctions. We are using financial sanctions to a greater extent than ever, and we're not the only ones, and it does have an effect on the utilization of sovereign currencies for exchange. That includes the euros. Euros notched down as an international currency when European sanctions on Russian gas started. So you can see these movements. Sanctions are very popular, particularly financial sanctions, because of the breadth. They clearly work less well over time. And at some point, technology is such that creating an alternative network to SWIFT or an alternative network that avoids the U.S. banking system is less and less difficult because it's already been created. So what should we watch out for? When are sanctions too much? And how do we evaluate their declining effectiveness over time?
Well, let me share with you my general perspective on this question. So on financial sanctions and this quote-unquote weaponization, I guess my view is if sanctions are used prudently and judiciously and multilaterally in conjunction with our allies, the fallout will be constrained. Now, that could be less corrosive of dollar dominance, but if they're used excessively and unilaterally, that becomes a problem. And obviously, the Chinese have taken note of what we did to the Russian oligarch and central bank assets, and others throughout the world have as well. I try to avoid politics, but I would say I think the Biden administration has been more thoughtful in its use of financial sanctions in terms of working multilaterally with allies than the previous Trump administration. Jack Lew in 2016, in one of his last speeches, warned about overuse of financial sanctions. And I think that we need to pay far more heed to his wise warning.
I think what we're seeing now is predictable. Sanctions tend to be most effective before you pull the trigger. They're supposed to be a deterrent. Once you pull the trigger, what you precipitate is a movement to try to figure out ways to get around them. It just coincidentally and unexpectedly, the Washington Post just put out today a huge article on sanctions with a lot of history, a lot of graphs and charts, and of course, most importantly, a quote from me about them. But one of the themes of the article is that it's never quite clear about the extent to which these things actually work. And it precipitates the financial ones as well as the non-financial ones, kind of a cat and mouse game where, and maybe Mark, from your years of Treasury, you can comment on this, where the United States imposes sanctions and then immediately the target goes to work finding ways around them, finding ways to conduct transactions that don't involve dollars, finding ways to avoid U.S. financial centers, finding ways to import the things they want, even though they've been banned. And then each time that happens, the U.S. government reacts with a response of its own. In the case of financial sanctions, the list of banned entities gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The game goes on. So I guess my questions for Mark are, does this in the end lead to overuse and diminishing return? Does it ultimately mean growing incentives to dispense with the dollar and try to develop alternative payment structures as the Russians and Chinese have done? Is it just something we have to live with? If you're going to play the game, this is what happens.
There's a long history on trade sanctions as well, which have been evaded. I think financial sanctions have been a little bit more effective than trade sanctions because of the dollar's dominant role. I would say that before 9/11, OFAC was a quiet little backwater in the Treasury, and its role has just grown by leaps and bounds. Some argue that sanctions are a way of having a stick. You want carrots, diplomacy, and sticks, war. But you don't want to go to war. So financial sanctions are a stick that you can use. And I think that's partly why they're very attractive to policymakers. You would argue they've become too attractive. I would have some great sympathy for you. Now, we discussed that it's difficult to get around the dollar's global dominance. You're right. I mentioned SIPs as a means of creating an alternative structure. You'll remember after the Trump administration abandoned the Iran trade deal, the Europeans were furious and tried to create a system called Instex. That didn't work out. I guess I think you're right. The more you use them, the more people find their ways around them, the more they get eroded. They still throw some sand in the gears, others doing things that you don't want. And again, I come back to my point. I think we need to be far more judicious and wise in using them. That having been said, by being multilateral in doing so and consultative with our allies, I think that minimizes the harm. And, one thing that reinforces that view in my thinking is that, there was an article written by a Fed guy, but he looked at dollar holdings, and some 75% of dollar holdings were in the hands of countries, according to his calculations, that had some form of military tie with the United States. So it's a complicated question. It's a very good question. U.S. officials need to think a lot more about financial sanctions and not overusing them.
Perhaps we could close with a topic that's really from the headlines, and it takes into account another part of your background, Mark, and that is your role in foreign exchange policy for the United States. The Trump campaign has announced that their policy preference is for a weak dollar. That's a change from even the prior Trump administration, at least in terms of public statements. What's going on here, and what should our listeners pay attention to during the campaign, and what are the likely outcomes?
Hey, let me just make the point that dollar dominance is here to stay for the foreseeable future. The alternatives aren't there. I think if the United States can remain a trusted partner, avoid overusing financial sanctions, maintain our economy's openness, and run better macro policies, the dollar's dominance will stay strongly intact. Now, my central point is we should do these things for our own good. But if we don't, then the USA itself is the biggest threat to dollar dominance. I've worked a lot on articles on the dollar's reserve role with Stephen Kamen, former head of the Fed International Financial Division. And he's a co-author, and he likes to say if the U.S. doesn't keep its house in better order, dollar dominance will be the least of our worries.
That's very true. It's still the least bad asset to hold. That there's something there, but we've got to do better.
It's in our own self-interest to do better. Let me turn that as a segue into your question. So first of all, currencies go up and down, right? That's the way markets work. If you go back to the global financial crisis, it took $1.6 to get a euro. Now it's about 1.09. So that's the way it is. And right now, the dollar is very strong. Foreign currencies are weak. This is largely a dollar story. It's due to U.S. budget deficits pushing up yields. It's due to the Fed raising rates to counter post-pandemic inflation. Europe's weak. Japan has zero rates. China's got the huge headwinds. All of this reinforces dollar strength. But this, again, is mainly a dollar story. One should never predict where exchange rates are headed. That's a fool's errand. But everybody expects the Fed to start cutting rates soon. That should ease dollar demand. And frankly, if one really wanted to lower the dollar, I think the U.S. should start running a sane fiscal policy. But of course, economists would debate that. So let me turn to what I think more narrowly is your question. It's all this talk we've seen from Lighthizer or Vance or Trump, or attributed to them anyway, about devaluing the dollar. So that's a different question than whether markets go up or down. I interpret this devaluation chatter as meaning that it should be the formal policy of the United States of America to significantly weaken the dollar, and we would direct our efforts towards that end. Now, first of all, let me just say that talking about devaluing the dollar and then preserving its reserve role, as a Republican platform states, seems to me woefully inconsistent. As a practical matter, calling for tax cuts and extension of past tax cuts would boost fiscal deficits and add to upward interest rate pressures, which might boost the dollar. Similarly, much higher tariffs could further boost the dollar, as markets viewed other countries' exports as less competitive. We saw that with China tariffs in 2018, 2019. So much of the Trump agenda in 2017 to 2019, in fact, pushed the dollar up. When I hear about devaluation, I fear the specter of beggar thy neighbor currency wars, a turn towards isolationism when coupled with protectionism that fragments the global economy and threatens our openness and undermining the properties that I outlined earlier that really sustain the dollar's dominant role. So, much higher tariffs could prove inflationary, tax consumers, hurt our openness. Our Peterson friends say Trump's proposed tax cuts could cost $1,700 a year for a middle-income family. One way to lower the dollar would be to curb capital inflow. We could do that by imposing taxes on capital inflow, but that might raise interest rates and be akin to shooting ourselves in our feet. We could mandate or artificially lower interest rates. We might say that might do the trick. But the Fed's independent. It has, as one of its mandates, the obligation to pursue price stability. We're members of the G7. We're members of the G20. And we've long pledged in those fora not to target exchange rates and to orient macro policy towards achievement of domestic objectives. Some think we could talk the dollar down. I doubt this would have any lasting impact, though it might undermine trust in U.S. leadership. Nor would unilateral U.S. intervention to lower the dollar. And frankly, that would fly in the history of the United States of floating and not intervening, and that might cause instability in global markets. I also think that intervention in the major G3 currencies would only likely have a short-lived impact unless it were highly sustained, massively, and it fed through into U.S. monetary policy. Now, some talk about a new Plaza Accord. Well, the 1985 G5 Plaza Accord included commitments by countries to prove their economic policies to buttress the desired movement in exchange rates. We said we'd get our budget deficit in order. I can assure you at the time we did not. Again, the Fed has a domestic mandate, and I don't see how the U.S., let alone in 1985, but now could make credible fiscal commitments given the complete utter mess of U.S. fiscal policy and that Congress plays a leading role on budgetary policy. So the bottom line, the dollar's going to fluctuate in markets. But if it's U.S. policy to drive the dollar down, first of all, I think the Trump policies pursued in 2017 and 2019 flew in the face of that and had the opposite effect. But undermining the properties that make the dollar a reserve currency might actually harm the U.S. I fully sympathize with the concerns over lost jobs in swaths of the heartland, but unemployment's now 4%. These jobs in many cases have been lost, not due to the dollar, but due to technological change, the shrinkage of manufacturing over decades, and yes, to some degree, globalization.
Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? No, that's it. And I would note that, like many former Treasury officials, that chip that they implanted before you left, which prevents you from commenting on the value of the dollar, still is functioning. We note that that's a successful enterprise. But Bill, you have any questions or comments on this? Other than the hypocrisy is something we're quite familiar with on the trade side.
Well, as we've said many times, in the world of trade and in the WTO world, there's no rule against hypocrisy. And certainly in presidential campaigns, there's no rule against hypocrisy either. So get used to it, everybody. I do want to follow up your last comments, Mark. Help us understand, just for the ordinary consumer, if the dollar significantly depreciated, would it have any effect on people's everyday life? What would happen?
So dollar depreciation at the margins is inflationary, but the U.S. is a largely closed economy. There's pass-through effects to consider, so there may not be any significant, necessarily major impact on inflation. It will raise the cost of imports, so consumers may have to pay more. Bill Reinsch's luxurious trips to Europe may be a little bit less luxurious. You'll have to drink cheap champagne as opposed to Dom Perignon. It may have some benefits from the global economy in the sense that emerging markets will be more easily able to service their liabilities. I should say, U.S. trade deficits may come down a bit, but who knows by how much. So, I think those are just some of the standard macro effects. Again, we have a floating currency. The dollar has moved around over time. Floating is not anything that people should worry about. I think floating, when backed by relatively decent macro policy, provides resilience to the global economy, much more so in contrast with some of the fixed exchange rate periods where we had some major crack-ups and currency crashes.
Currency depreciation for the purpose of export competitiveness is a double-edged sword these days because $1 trillion of our imports are intermediate goods. That is, things used to make other things. And so there's a countervailing effect there that would make our exports less competitive because we've chosen through dollar depreciation to make imports more expensive. And we're using the imports to make our own manufactured goods. It's never as cut and dried as a politician's speech.
As I said, we should just focus on doing what's right for our own economy. And if we do what's right for the U.S., the dollar will do just fine, and we need not worry about this.
It sounds like, from what you're saying, that the sanest or most responsible way to achieve that result would be if the Fed decides to lower interest rates, which it will do not because it has a dollar objective, but because it has an inflation objective, and it feels that inflation is dissipating, and economists seem to be anticipating a rate reduction. I guess if they persisted doing that, that will cool off some of the demand for dollars. And if not weaken it, at least stop its further strengthening. Is that a fair analysis?
So first of all, I started off by saying one should never predict where foreign exchange rates are headed. It's a fool's errand. And then one other comment on yours before I answer your question, which is, in my remarks earlier, I distinguished between markets doing their thing versus a conscious policy of devaluation. Okay, so we're in the realm of the former now.
That's what I was asking about.
Yes, exactly. I want to make sure that we're got you pigeonholed appropriately, Bill. So now, then the question is, what would lower the dollar? And you're right, lower interest rates would be one factor. The dollar is super strong right now due to the Fed, the U.S. fiscal policy, U.S. outperformance, and the weakness elsewhere. Lower interest rates definitely would help. In the last few days, the dollar's been coming off against some of, the carry trade currencies because people see the Fed cutting in sight in September starting. So definitely you have a point. From a longer term perspective, I also think fiscal policy now is a factor because it puts upward pressure on rates and it supports demand. Some economists might say, oh no, if we ran a better fiscal policy, that would improve confidence in the United States and help the dollar. But I tend to think at this time, if the U.S. were running a better fiscal policy, that too would lessen some of the upward pressure on the dollar. So I agree with your point, Bill. Don't forget fiscal policy.
This gives me the opportunity to remind everybody that last time we had a budget surplus, which I think connotes a responsible fiscal policy, was with Bill Clinton. And people tend to forget that. But we had 3 years of surplus, 3 years of deficit reduction. I was in the administration at the time. I take absolutely no credit for it. We'll give Mark the credit for it because I think he was in the administration at the time. But it's been 20 years, nearly 25 years since that happened. And we've had ballooning deficits ever since. So nobody should be surprised at the situation we're in. I think what Clinton demonstrated, and, he was the first person to run a surplus, for decades before, it can be done. But doing it is painful. And in his case, it required congressional legislation that, among other things, raised taxes and cut some benefits. And there were people in the administration that resigned over that. It was not an easy thing to do, but it got the job done. Other people would, I think, point out that he benefited from fortuitous timing on the digital boom, for example. But, these things come along. I couldn't agree with you more, Mark. It would be nice to get back to responsible fiscal policy. I'm not sure that either candidate is talking very much about that right now. And it's frustrated me for years because it's become this sort of a partisan thing. Whichever party is in, the other party becomes the party of responsible fiscal policy and anti-spending. Policies that they completely ignored when they were in, but when they're out, suddenly it matters. So the Republicans blew through the budget when Trump was in, and the minute Biden came in and started to do the same thing, suddenly the Republicans were all for fiscal responsibility. If Trump wins, then I can guarantee you the Democrats will be for fiscal responsibility and will be opposing all the things that he wants to do that they think will be irresponsible.
Bill, those smash mouth politics go all the way back to those halcyon days of the Clinton administration. And one of the reasons that we had a surplus is we had a Republican Congress who wouldn't let Clinton spend and a Democratic president who wouldn't cut taxes. So sometimes the tension is helpful, but you're absolutely right about the hypocrisy.
Well, I'm not sure that running a budget surplus is in sight, but we can be responsible with far lower deficits. And
we could do better. You're right.
Just getting it down would be helpful, yes.
Yes.
Exactly. Way down, yeah.
Well, Mark, thanks so much for joining the program. We really appreciate your insights, and I know our audience is going to benefit from hearing your remarks on this. You've helped us in many ways. You're welcome back anytime. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you for having me. A great honor.
Thank you. And for our listeners, we'll be back next week with another topic.
Hope to see you then.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.